Hey everybody, Brian Glynn here from Trōv. Thank you for joining us again today. We're delighted to have another true world leader in the field of mobility joining us today for a brief discussion. So without further ado, let's get into it. Our guest today is Dr. Susan Shaheen, professor in civil and environmental engineering at University of California, Berkeley, and co-director for the Transportation Sustainability Research Center. Dr. Shaheen, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Brian.
Yeah. Maybe to kick us off, you might tell us a little bit about yourself and about your background, and we can go from there.
Sure. So I have been actively involved in studying disruptions and advanced technology in transportation since the mid 1990s. I've done my doctoral work in this area and continued to be fascinated by issues associated with technological adoption in the context of environmental and social impacts, including mobility justice.
Great, thanks for the introduction. So to kick it off today, I was doing some research and came across a really great interview you'd done on the UNU podcast recently. And you talked a little bit about this concept of the Overton window. You got into some great detail on kind of radical ideas and how academia can help bring those radical ideas to life in industry. I guess the transportation and mobility industry has some elements of it that maybe are a little bit conservative and a bit slower to adopt radical ideas. And from the Trōv perspective, the insurance industry obviously thinks radical ideas and thinks about risk, which can be a bit challenging. Would love to hear maybe your perspective on this concept of bringing these radical mobility ideas to life and how academia plays a vital role in that world.
Sure, Ryan. Yeah, the Overton window concept is one that was introduced actually by John Overton in the 1990s. And the Overton window actually refers to just that window of what is politically possible to the mainstream. And so the conversation I had on that recent podcast had a lot to do with the role that academia may play in helping to prepare us for what's outside of the Overton window. And one of the things that academia, I think, is really good at is exploring innovation and new ideas, being in the forefront, going and doing pilot projects and doing evaluations, developing new models for understanding relationships between the built environment, society, and technology, and creating an understanding of what the possibilities might look like before some of those technologies are appearing in society or just appearing in small places. And so our work in academia often embraces this idea of uncertainty and scenarios. And so I think that the Overton window can be expanded somewhat by bringing in an academic type of perspective.
And is there maybe examples of cities that you think have been, quite effective in embracing some of those new forms and those new perspectives better than other? We're here in the Bay Area in California, where we like to think we're at the leading edge of an awful lot of these types of technologies. Are there other kind of regions or cities in the US that you might think of as being better at opening that Overton window a little bit wider?
Well, I think there's a tremendous amount of mobility exploration and testing going on. If it's automated vehicles being tested in Las Vegas, for example, or parts of Florida, or if we're thinking about innovations that came before, things like car sharing, which is similar to these ideas like the zip car model, where a car goes into and out of the same location, or the gig car sharing model, which is one way where you go point to point. A lot of these systems have been tested in different parts of the United States. Zipcar heralds from Boston, and Boston also does a lot of innovative testing right along with the Bay Area. I did my doctoral work on the first advanced IT-based car sharing system in North America, just here in the Bay Area, not very far from where you're located. So those are, I think, some examples. And of course, there's examples of very advanced, innovative cities all across the globe.
Great. I'm glad you mentioned car share, and as you've alluded to, some of your early research was around car share, and I think you're well recognized kind of globally at this point as a real leader Trōv has had lots of interest and success in the car sharing space as well, working with folks like Free to Move, the PSA group, and them being a customer of ours going back to 2018. I know you've talked a bit about car share and kind of what was the tipping point that really allowed it to break through and become really mainstream. And I heard you mention previously a period around 2010 when you had a lot of these kind of enabling technologies coming to the fore that allowed car share to really become mainstream. Like, we often think of insurance as an enabling technology for all sorts of mobility, and insurance solutions helping that. Would love you to maybe talk a little bit about that period in 2010 and what you saw happening then, and if there are like other enabling technologies happening now in our in 2020 that can lead to kind of similar changes in the years to come.
All right, that's a really insightful question. So with car sharing, it was first introduced in the Switzerland area in the 1940s. And it was a concept. The first program was actually called Cephage, and people shared these cars as a way to reduce their own personal transportation expenditures, because sometimes you just need a vehicle to get around. And so this concept has been with us for a very, very long time. And information technology has been a part of enabling it to expand into different types of forms and business models. And so the predominant model is this round trip model where you go into and out of the same location. And that dates back all the way to the Cephage model from Switzerland. But what I started to see in about 2010 was, with the breakthrough of the smartphone technology, which happened a few years earlier, what we started to see was the transportation sector and shared mobility being a place where a lot of private sector companies, if they were startups, tech firms, or basically an automaker, I was going to call them an original equipment manufacturer, OEM, but that's probably a little too wonky. So the automakers themselves really getting involved in this space. And so what we started to see were new models coming into existence. Now, we had been talking about these innovations for a long time, but we hadn't seen them deployed. So things like the one-way model, where you don't have to go into and out of the same location. You can if you want to, but it's more of a free floating or station-based type of system. So it supports a one-way type of trip. And then you see the peer-to-peer model, where people can put their own personal vehicles into a shared fleet. Those often function much more like a round-trip system, but essentially it's the collaborative economy, the sharing economy, where people are putting their own vehicles in. And so what we also witnessed was people bringing in more electrification into the vehicle systems. And so after about 2010 onward, we really started to see a lot more innovation and creativity with respect to the operations of these systems, because it now became more possible from the back end of operations, but also making it more convenient for the customer on the front end through the smartphone technology.
That's really interesting that all of those kind of enabling technologies converged around the same time. Is there anything you're seeing in the market today that indicates that there are new enabling technologies that are coming to the fore that might lead to similar advances over the next number of years?
Yeah, I think automation is coming, and
Yeah.
I'm probably going to say something that you might not think I was going to say. So a lot of folks over the last 5 years or so have been talking about these revolutions, these great disruptions, including full-on automated technology. And I do think that's really interesting. And we're seeing quite a bit of development, particularly in the low-speed shuttle area or in truck platooning. But the idea of being in full-on automation in a dense urban environment is pretty tricky. It's also pretty tricky to try to deploy that in environments where the roadway infrastructure may really not be where it needs to be to support it in terms of providing good solid pavement infrastructure or the striping. that's needed for the sensors to read it. But I think what's happening in automation is pretty amazing. There's many levels of automation. And so I think partial automation of these vehicles will make them even safer, which I bet Trōv would like from an actuarial risk assessment standpoint. So I think that we may see more development taking advantage of some of the lower levels of automation as opposed to a lot of the hype that we've heard around a full automated robotaxi type of vehicle experience, which may be some way away, if not decades and decades away in reality. And I also think we're hearing more and more about electrification. This is not a new technology. I've been working on it since I was a doctoral student, but I think that the policy environment is very robust. There's a lot of concern about climate change and starting to really invest in our infrastructure. We're hearing a lot about building back better. And so I think this connectivity, the connected and maybe partially automated vehicle that's also connected to infrastructure associated with the grid and electrification will start to really be a major component more and more of the shared mobility types of systems we've been talking about for decades.
That's great. I think, as you alluded to, any moves towards safer and cleaner fleets and cleaner transportation is certainly something that Trōv is on board with. Maybe the last area to ask you about is another, I know, very important focus of your research. In particular, this year, we're at the end of 2020, a very challenging year for so many people. Would love you to tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing as it relates to how COVID-19 has affected mobility systems, and in particular, how that relates to kind of social equity within mobility.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian, for raising this issue. I have been studying forms of shared mobility for well over 2 decades. And what I was always curious to see in the data was that these types of shared mobility services could bring mobility and accessibility to people who really needed it, people who didn't have access to a car but could greatly benefit from shared access to it, or a shared scooter or bike. And for a long time, I didn't really see an indication that a lot of these types of services were serving those individuals. You know, they attract a lot of attention from well-educated, upwardly mobile people who really love and embrace technology and apps and collect apps and really find it quite fascinating to use these services. But the people who have restricted mobility and don't own a car or don't have easy access to a car are really the people that I was most interested in trying to serve. Of course, I'm interested in mainstreaming these concepts across the board, but I increasingly became concerned about the digital and income divide, particularly as it relates to innovation. If you can't afford a smartphone, or you're not trained to use a smartphone, or you can't afford the smartphone cell plan that you need in order to use these types of services, it essentially restricts access. And so when COVID-19 hit, I think it really exposed a lot of inequities and concerns in our overall transportation infrastructure. Public transit has been devastated by COVID-19, and many marginalized populations depend on public transit to get around. And so we've been really focused on understanding how best to respond to this crisis as we move through the recovery, and to ensure that we are prioritizing public transit and shared mobility services for marginalized populations and essential workers as we come back from this crisis. And so I think it's so important that all of us think about disruptions and what those disruptions might bring, how they will affect the labor force. Any changes in automation could mean that we need to retrain workers. Sure. And so lots and lots of very important issues for us to think about as we recover from this virus. But I think it's exposed a lot of inequities to a lot more people. And I think social justice and mobility justice are really going to be more and more part of our day-to-day conversation in the mobility industry.
Great, thank you for that. Maybe before we wrap up, as we head into 2021, we're always keen to find out kind of where are our experts, increasing their knowledge base, and where should we all across the industry be keeping an eye out for what's coming next. Would love to hear if you have any maybe suggestions or recommendations for industry news in the mobility ecosystem here. Where do you go to get your newsletters and podcasts and news from?
Yeah, well, I actually do a lot of traditional theoretical types of reading alongside keeping on top of what's going on the internet. A couple of resources that I'd like to mention to all of you that are near and dear to my heart. So the first is the Transportation Research Board, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences. And at present, I'm actually serving as the vice chair of the TRB Executive Committee, and will become the incoming chair in January. And this is a great time to register to attend that conference. It is now going to be a month-long conference in January 2021, and it's going to happen over the internet. So a lot more people are going to be able to attend than were able to participate in these events in the past. So take a look and register for that event. There's going to be more discussions than you can probably attend around innovation, impacts of COVID-19, technology. I'm running a Sunday workshop on the impacts of COVID-19 on shared mobility and public transit. So you can learn about that at trb.org. And then I also wanted to share with you a website that I think is pretty interesting. Our center joined along with a number of very prominent organizations in this space, including NUMO and the World Economic Forum, to put together a COVID mobility data set online that tells you what's happening around the world in terms of COVID-19 response, in terms of public transit, shared mobility. And you can go to that at covidmobilityworks.org. I'd also love to share with you that I have a weekly newsletter that you can sign up for. I feature 5 stories in the disruption space per week, and you can sign up for that on my website at imr.berkeley.edu. Also, there's many opportunities to connect with your colleagues through organizations like NACTO, which represents city and transportation officials. I've already mentioned NUMO. This is an organization that Robin Chase, a fellow shared mobility thought leader, she was the founder of Zipcar, created. I highly recommend that. So there's lots to keep up with, and just make sure to take advantage of all of the assets we have access to now through the internet and through these Zoom platforms.
Fantastic, and we'll make sure to link to all of those resources that Dr. Shaheen mentioned in the when we post this video as well. I think that just about wraps us up for today, but finally, just to say a huge thank you to Dr. Shaheen for joining us, and to all our guests for joining us on these podcast series all year. Thank you so much, and wishing everybody a very happy and healthy 2021. Thank you, Dr. Shaheen.
Thanks, Brian.